Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're diving into something absolutely wild, a real convergence of ancient philosophy and modern medical data. We're tackling a concept that's literally haunted humanity for thousands of years, the underworld. But we're not looking at it the usual way. What if, and just stick with me here, what if the underworld isn't some fiery destination you get sent to, but an intensely personal experience generated entirely from within?
I mean, think about it. Is hell a physical place with coordinates and actual geography, or is it just a terrifying state of mind? It's a heavy question, I know, but that is exactly the mystery we're decoding today. We're going to challenge everything you thought you knew and look at the actual, raw mechanics of these deeply unsettling experiences.
Okay, let's set our baseline. For a lot of us, traditional hell is seen as this eternal, physical realm of divine punishment, right? Unending torment, fiery pits, a life sentence handed down by a higher power. It's the classic definition. But let's dive into this and see how two completely different frameworks, one from antiquity and one from the bleeding edge of modern clinical research, completely dismantle this whole idea.
Section 1. Rethinking the Underworld.
Section 2. Naraka, the Buddhist hell. So, when we look at the highly analytical framework of ancient Theravada Buddhism, the definition of the underworld completely shifts. Here, it's called Naraka. It's one of 4 woeful states, known as apayas. But here's the real game changer. It's temporary, and it's governed entirely by natural law, not divine punishment. There's no supreme judge banging a gavel. Instead, this Buddhist underworld operates completely mechanically. It is purely driven by the natural cycle of samsara, the cycle of rebirth.
Now, what's super fascinating is just how vividly the ancient texts describe this environment. They actually categorize Naraka into these incredibly detailed levels. You've got Mahanaraka, the great hells, which are defined by extreme agonizing heat, places like Avicii, and then surrounding those are the Usada Naraka, the minor hells. When you read this, it sounds so physical, right? Almost like a map you could follow. But hold on to that thought, because we're about to uncover the psychological root behind all this intense heat and suffering.
So, how does someone actually end up in Naraka? Well, it's all about the mechanics of kama. Step 1 is akusala kama, which basically means unwholesome actions. And these actions are specifically driven by our own internal mental states: lobha, which is greed; dosa, hatred; and moha, delusion. This flows right into step 2, where this negative karmic energy literally projects the being into the experience of Naraka. It's a manifestation. Finally, step 3 is exhaustion. Because the whole thing is fueled by a specific amount of negative energy, the suffering itself is finite. Once that specific energy runs out, the being is simply reborn elsewhere. Greed, hatred, and delusion act as the literal fuel for this temporary experience.
And that brings us to the absolutely crucial takeaway here. These realms, even though they've been historically described as intensely physical places, are actually powerful reflections of a tormented mind. They're just illustrating the raw intensity of mental suffering that comes from our own internal hatred and cruelty. Basically, Naraka is an intense externalization of inner turmoil. Keep that ancient psychological insight in your back pocket, because it perfectly sets up our modern scientific comparison.
Section 3. Science and near-death experiences.
Okay, shifting gears entirely. We're moving from ancient Eastern philosophy to rigorous modern Western science. Let's look at the research coming out of the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS. Led by prominent scientists like Dr. Bruce Grayson, this group investigates reports of consciousness during periods of apparent clinical death. And to be clear, this is empirical, systematic investigation. They aren't preaching theology here. They are gathering hard data from real people whose hearts have literally stopped beating.
And their scientific stance on this is incredibly important to note. DAPS researchers don't claim to prove the existence of hell. Instead, they treat near-death experiences, or NDEs, as functionally real for the person experiencing them, meaning the subject genuinely went through it. The researchers neutrally analyze this subjective data to try and understand the fundamental nature of human consciousness.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is the duality of it. There's this huge spectrum of experience. On one hand, you have positive NDEs, people reporting light, peace, and love. These usually leave folks with a significantly reduced fear of death. But on the flip side, you have distressing or hellish NDEs, and these are characterized by profound darkness, extreme isolation, and just terrifying environments. Yet here's the wild part. Surprisingly, both types lead to deeply life-altering permanent shifts in the person's values and priorities afterward.
Section 4. Anatomy of a Hellish NDE.
Diving respectfully into these actual, terrifying experiential reports, researchers found some very common, deeply unsettling themes across cultures. The first one is profound darkness and isolation. Patients consistently report this haunting feeling of being trapped in an empty, freezing cold, or completely dark void. It's essentially a total stripping away of all comfort and connection.
Next up is the theme of judgment and review. Experiencers often say they felt completely exposed to the consequences of their past actions. It's usually perceived as this spontaneous, highly intense life review. And honestly, notice how incredibly closely this mirrors the mechanics of karma and unwholesome actions we just talked about in Theravada Buddhism. The parallels are absolutely there. And then, unfortunately, there's fear and aggression. Subjects objectively report terrifying encounters with hostile or tormenting entities. It's described as an intensely aggressive, just totally overwhelming psychological assault.
But here is where the science really connects the dots for us. Researchers identified something we can call the mind's filter. Basically, how does a person's individual background actually shape this nightmare? Well, first, there's a cultural filter. A person's religious upbringing largely dictates the specific scenery or aesthetic of the underworld they experience. Second is their psychological state. Pre-existing guilt, deep anxiety, or unresolved trauma literally color and construct the horrifying nature of the experience. The set and setting of your own mind completely builds the illusion you feel trapped in.
Which brings us to an absolutely amazing paradox. Even though these experiences are objectively terrifying, survivors of hellish NDEs frequently report returning to waking life with a profound shift toward compassion or renewed spiritual seeking. It's completely counterintuitive, right? The darkest, most frightening encounter a human mind can generate actually acts as a massive catalyst for personal growth.
Section 5. The Mind as Hell.
And this brilliantly illustrates our synthesis. Look at how perfectly these two entirely different worlds align. Theravada Buddhism tells us the underworld is the mechanical result of past actions, fueled by internal greed, hatred, and delusion. And right alongside that, Adop's research concludes that distressing NDEs are direct reflections of the experiencer's internal state, their deep-seated fears, and unresolved psychological burdens.
The ultimate takeaway here is mind-blowing. Both traditions entirely agree. The terrifying experience of the underworld is intimately, inextricably tied to the content of the experiencer's own mind. Hell isn't a permanent physical destination you're sent to as punishment. It is a vivid, horrifying reflection of the unresolved pain, guilt, and actions you already carry within yourself. Which leaves us with one final, profound thought to ponder today. If our own unresolved burdens, our unwholesome actions, and deeply held fears have the power to vividly create the underworld, what happens when we finally choose to confront and heal our own consciousness? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it challenged how you see the mind, and I can't wait to dive into our next topic with you.